My name is Amanda Gunter, and I am one of the directors here at Brain Balance. And I just want to welcome you this evening to our webinar. We're going to be discussing the brain and sensory processing. So, throughout the evening, we're going to be asking you poll questions. And so, I encourage you to answer the polls and please participate. I love hearing so much insight and information from you guys, and it helps me be able to talk to you guys and speak to our audience. So, our first poll question for tonight is: this is your first time joining us on one of our webinars. Again, we're excited that you're here, that you're spending your evening with us, and I'm really hoping that you will get some good information and have some new takeaways, that you walk away with having a better understanding of what's going on with the brain related to sensory processing. So, sure enough, so far it looks like 78% of you guys are new to our webinars. So again, welcome, welcome. We're super excited that you're here. I want you to know that there's plenty of ways to communicate with us tonight. I'm going to be asking live questions or answering live questions at the end of this evening. But also, these are the centers that are participating in this evening's webinar. We have 4 centers in California: Chula Vista, Encinitas, Redlands, San Diego. We have Norwalk, Connecticut, Wilmington, Delaware, several centers in Florida, from Central Florida, Coral Springs, Jacksonville, Naples, Palm Beach, and West Chase. We have 3 centers in Georgia: Peachtree City, Roswell, Suwanee, Plainfield, Indiana. We have 3 centers in Kansas, which is Overland Park, Kansas City, Wichita. We have Oakland County, Michigan, Woodbury, Minnesota, Omaha, Nebraska, Summit and Bergen County, New Jersey, Plainview, New York, Charlotte and Cornelius, North Carolina, Columbus and Cincinnati, Ohio, Wexford, Pennsylvania, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, Farragut, Franklin, Tennessee, Allen, Fort Worth, Lubbock, Texas, Midlothian, Glen Allen, Virginia, Mequon, and Fox Valley, Wisconsin. So these are their phone numbers. Again, if you're on the East Coast, it might be a little late for one of our centers to be open. However, if you're on the West Coast, I'm sure they're still open. These are the phone numbers you can actually call and speak with someone. We also have texting phone numbers in the chat. So if you want to text a specific question about your child to a center director, please feel free to text. Those are in the chat. And then, like I said, at the end of our presentation, I'm going to answer live questions as well. So I hope that you guys stick around and, again, participate in the polls. I love hearing back from you. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what is sensory processing? Well, the definition is the effective registration and accurate interpretation of sensory input in the environment, including one's body. It's the way that the brain receives, organizes, and responds to sensory input in order to behave in a meaningful and consistent manner. So basically, there's obviously senses all of around us, from auditory, visual, tactile, even smell, or what we call olfactory. And it's the way that the brain receives it, organizes that sensory input, and then responds to the sensory input in an appropriate way. So, one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is, what if you have a child or a young adult, or even you as an adult, struggle with responding appropriately to sensory input? So here's my first or next question. And that is, does your child have any of the following diagnoses: sensory processing disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, maybe autism, an other diagnosis, or that you have no formal diagnosis, but maybe you're seeing some symptoms that you may be concerned about related to sensory processing? My background is in education. I've been with Brain Balance for over 16 years. And that's exactly, I served children that really struggled with sensory processing, from children that had an autism diagnosis or a sensory processing disorder diagnosis, or sometimes we had children that were diagnosed with behavioral disorders when the reality was that they actually struggled with sensory processing because it caused so much inappropriate behavior and meltdowns that they were diagnosed with a behavioral disorder when really there were other things that were going on that was causing those behaviors. So sure enough, we have a wide variety with us tonight. You have 25% with sensory processing, 23% with anxiety disorder, 25% autism, 26% other, and 39% of you guys have no formal diagnosis. And that's okay. We really, at Brain Balance, we really focus on understanding the root causes of why you're seeing the symptoms you're seeing. And the reality is that if you look at DSM diagnoses, they're just lists of symptoms, right? It's like if your child qualifies because they display a certain amount of symptoms. And so that is something that really what it boils down to is, that's what a diagnosis is symptoms. And so tonight, I really want to dig deeper and we really want to discuss why perhaps you're seeing the symptoms you're seeing or experiencing as a family, what's going on in the brain, and what can we do about it. So here are some of those symptoms that we're talking about. Signs of sensory overload. Um, there are many of those signs. You have becoming disoriented or confused. So your child can easily become disoriented when you're just like, what's going on? We were in a good place. He was having a good time. And then all of a sudden, it's like a flip of a switch and they really are struggling behaviorally. You can see the unprovoked crying. You can see where maybe they cover their eyes or they cover their ears to shut out the stimulus. They may hum loudly and rock back and forth. They may feel nauseous or even vomit. They can appear to have like a flushed face or sweaty palms or clammy skin, or you can feel like their little heart is racing. They can be completely checked out and just you feel like they're not present with you in the moment. So, those are all symptoms of sensory overload, which really means that they're having a hypersensitivity or they're oversensitive to stimuli, meaning that they're easily overwhelmed by maybe people or places. They can be sensitive to bright lights and visual clutter, preferring certain clothes, soft clothing versus scratchy clothes or tags. They may avoid wanting to be hugged and be touched. They could easily gag or vomit over smells because maybe smell is very much a hypersensitivity. They can easily startle with sudden noises, such as emergency, fire engines and ambulances and or classroom like bells ringing or the fire alarm. I know when I was an educator, they would warn me if a fire alarm was going to happen because all of my students, we would have to prep them and get ready for the fire alarm. And then there was 2 a year that they required for us to not tell our kids about. And we really just had to more or less figure out how we get them out because of course we're not going to be able to prep them if it's really a fire, right? And so many times my students would hide or they would run under desks, and hold their ears. And so literally myself and my assistants had to physically pick them up and carry them out. And we practiced that only twice a year because, imagine I had middle schoolers. So imagine having to do that every month that you have a fire drill, right? That would have been horrible. So luckily they gave me an accommodation where they didn't warn me only twice a year and the rest of the time they would warn us so we can get the kids out ahead of time. So those are different examples of hypersensitivity. Then we have signs of sensory seeking, right? Where perhaps your child is a space invader and they're always roughhousing and they're always wanting to play rough and they're really over rough and they don't realize how their strength can really hurt somebody. Maybe they need to cuddle or they need to be touching you all the time, or there's uncontrollable movement such as hand flapping or bouncing or spinning, chewing on their clothes or pencils. Perhaps, some risky behavior, especially with teenagers. You see that sensory seeking and when they're young, become a little bit more inappropriate when they become teenagers. Breaking the rules and feeling like they need that rush, or they're not aware of safety. They don't care about safety. And then of course with teenagers and young adults, we're seeing a much more high risk of self-harm, meaning that they're not physically feeling their body because they're hyposensitive to touch, and so other areas that you can see symptoms is bedwetting, hurting pets or hurting their friends without meaning to, injuries and tripping and bumping, and yet their knees could be bloody and they're not even crying and they don't even feel it. That's an example of hyposensitivity. And really just struggling overall, with breaking things, and then not really feeling their body, not really smelling things appropriately. When you're cooking something really good, do they even smell that you're cooking? So those are things that are signs and symptoms of hyposensitivity. So when we're looking at sensory processing, you have hypersensitivity and you have hyposensitivity. And so those are just examples of some symptoms that you could be seeing in your child or a young adult or even you as an adult. So here's a question. It says, I feel like my child or young adult is struggling with. Do you feel like it's more hypersensitive? Do you feel like it's hyposensitive? Or do you feel like there's signs of both? And it's okay if you feel like there's signs of both. We're actually going to talk about that tonight because that is very common. And so we're going to talk about why that is, and then also what's going on in the brain that's causing that. So let's see what you guys have to say. All right, 56% say, gosh, I see signs of both. Whereas 29% says hypersensitivity and 15% say hyposensitivity. But we'll talk about why you're seeing both. That's definitely something that is very common. So this really can affect all areas of your life. And you may be like, Amanda, no joke. Because as a parent or even as an educator, which I hope we have some professionals on tonight. And if we do, we've got something special for you guys at the end. So please stay tuned and we'll talk about that. But, it affects all environments, right? It can affect school because we all know there's constant noises at school, from the cafeteria to the classroom. There's so many different noises, kids chattering, that when you have difficulties in sensory processing, it's so hard to learn optimally because your brain feels like scrambled eggs and they're just trying to process so many different things that's going on around them, from cafeteria food smells to the class bell to yelling and shouting to even like simple things as like crumpling of papers. Those all can be impactful on how your child or even young adult, if you're in college, how you're learning. Then we think about like social life and family time, right? When you want to do fun things with your child, you want to go on vacations, you want to be able to take them to theme parks, or, we just had Easter, right? And Passover, and there's Easter egg hunts, and there's, big family dinners and meals. And yet, this is where it could be a challenge having your child or maybe you as an adult really struggle with those type of group environments. Other areas where It really is affecting home life. It can affect daily life. It can affect school life. The reality is that it really can affect all areas. And I want you to really think about that right now, because obviously, if you have a child or you have a young adult, or even you as an adult, like, you've got concerns. So, what is it? What are the areas of your life that you're really struggling with and that your child's struggling with? Because that's definitely something that's impactful. Now, if you're an adult, sensory processing is actually really important as well, right? Because it's the same thing. Instead of it being at school, right? It's now you're in a work environment. And how do you collaborate with a team, or how do you work with a team? Or maybe you're not working with a team and you're in a small cubicle, right? But yet you can hear Jim next door crinkling paper, or they bring this food, like homemade food that has all these smells that makes you want to gag, right? So it can really just impact not only your work environment, but if you're in college, it can impact obviously there. And then think about social life, and do you have social anxiety and difficulties with going into large groups, and the sounds and the unexpected? You don't know what's going to happen. And so, therefore, you're nervous because you can't control the fact that your brain is struggling with processing all of the sounds and smells and noises. Even in teenagers, it can impact their willingness to drive, or even in adults, right? It can be where you're struggling with driving. And then, of course, it can impact adult relationships if you're touch avoidant, or you don't want to have loud discussions. And so that can just cause relational stress, right? And then if you're parenting on top of that, imagine the impact. So, it's not only a struggle for children, it can absolutely be a struggle for adults, and especially post COVID, right? Where we were withdrawn so much more. And I know for myself, I mean, I joke around with my friends, but when it comes to restaurants, I'm like willing to go early to eat, right? Like, avoid the crowds, avoid the waits. And so I think, in a sense, that, we've all had some difficulties having to bounce back, right? But of course, the more that you bounce back from COVID and you are out more, then obviously you should see tremendous improvements. So what if you're not? What if things aren't improving and things just continue to get worse post COVID? So here's a question, where do you feel like your child or young adult is struggling in life the most? Um, Many times our families say, it's all of the above. It's home life, school life, social life, and then also, how significant do you feel like this is impacting, your whole family, and perhaps their relationship with their siblings? It's so hard when you have a child that's struggling with sensory processing, and you guys are having to consider, do we do the fun parks? Do we do the fun, neighborhood gatherings? What do we do? Do we need to divide and conquer? Many times I've heard families say, I feel like we're walking on eggshells. And I know that, my child doesn't want that. My child wants to have fun. They want to be a part of things, and yet they're really struggling. So, sure enough, it says 54% of you guys say all of the above, which that's exactly what we hear often. 25% say school life. And then sure enough, it says, 33% are saying four, extremely significant, five of 28%. So, over 60% of you guys are saying that it's really significant. So let's really talk about, well, why? Why? What is going on? And why is there difficulty with behavior? Why is there difficulty perhaps with focus, attention, memory? Because, of course, when that brain is stressed and they're really struggling with sensory processing, like I said, it affects academics, life skills, social skills. But here's what the research says: is that it really comes down to a lack of brain connectivity, that the brain is not developing optimally and is not cross communicating effectively and efficiently. And so, because there are underconnections in the brain taking place and even over connections taking place, that it impacts that connectivity. And so, that's really what the research says. So, the question is what does that even mean? What do we do about it? So, the first thing we really look at brain balance is we look at this through the lens of a developmental perspective. So, all of the symptoms that I just discussed, I want you to think about the picture of an iceberg, right? And oftentimes in an iceberg, what do you see? You see the tip. That's what you're able to see, and that's what you're experiencing. Now, many times I've had parents be like, Amanda, the list of symptoms of behavioral and social concerns due to a lack of sensory processing is monumental, right? Because you're seeing it's the visible symptoms, you're living it every day. But think about an iceberg. There's so much you can't see, right? And yet, when we think about Titanic, what sunk the ship? It was what they didn't see, you know? And that's really why we use the picture of an iceberg, because we really want you to think about that what you're not seeing is you're not seeing how well your child's brain is processing. What you're not seeing is how well you as an adult or even a young adult, your brain is processing, because you can't really see it, right? But what the research is saying is that you have to have optimal processing to have a brain that's teachable, to have a brain that's able to reason and critically think. To have a brain that can learn, you have to have optimal processing taking place. Now, how do you get to optimal processing? Well, we have to look at things, like I said, from a developmental perspective on how the brain neurotypically develops. So, the first thing we look at is we look at what we call primitive reflexes. Now, primitive reflexes are basically survival reflexes that every baby's born with. They facilitate in the birthing process. The spinal column moves the baby through the birth canal. If you ever have a baby around, put your finger in the baby's hand. They'll automatically clench to your finger. They're involuntary motor responses because when a baby's born, their brain isn't fully developed, right? So there's these survival reflexes that helps regulate your baby's nervous system. All right. And then we have, okay, how does the brain develop? Well, it's through senses. So, what a baby sees, hears, smells, and feels. So, tactile stimulation, auditory stimulation, visual stimulation, even olfactory, which is smell. So, senses develop the brain, and then motor develops the brain. Gross motor, fine motor. All right. So, all of these things are very critical for optimal processing. And what processing is multi-sensory processing, right? Where that brain is able to integrate all of the senses and motor and really be able to grow and develop the brain. All right. Well, primitive reflexes, again, are active at birth, and they're really important for the first year to 18 months of life. All right. But as your baby's brain is developing through sensory input and through motor input and motor development, gross motor, fine motor, these primitive reflexes should integrate and they should no longer be present. All right. So as the brain's maturing, your baby and your child should no longer need these reflexes. All right. However, all right, when there's still primitive reflexes present, what can happen is that it can cause a child or even an adult to go from parasympathetic into sympathetic response. So we have both nervous systems, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Parasympathetic is what we call rest and digest, meaning your heart rate's normal, you're digesting your food, you're using the area of the brain for reasoning and comprehension. You've got good processing going on, right? And then you have sympathetic, which sympathetic is more of what I like to say, more of the emotional area of the brain, where the nervous system is heightened. Okay. And it can actually heighten sensory input. It can make noises louder. It can make visual input more intense. It can make smells more intense. It can make tactile or touch more intense because the nervous system is in a sympathetic response, which causes more of a fight, flight, or freeze response. All right. And when you're a child or a young adult or even an adult still has active primitive reflexes, it's almost like a flip of a switch can happen where they're calm, they're good, they're learning, they're handling the group environment. And then because primitive reflexes are active due to immaturities in the brain, all of a sudden, boom, it's like their nervous system goes into that sympathetic response and they go into fight, flight, or freeze. And then that's when you can see elevated sensory hypersensitivity taking place. So here's an example. There's many primitive reflexes, all right, that we look at Brain Balance. This is one example, what we call the Moreau reflex or the startle reflex. Now, in a baby, right, they're sleeping, life is good. If you ever watch a baby sleep, it's adorable. But then a loud noise happens. Well, because that brain is still learning and is still developing tremendously, and the baby's reliant on an adult, right, or a caregiver or a parent. If there's a loud noise, it activates their startle reflex, and then they go into fight, flight, or freeze, where it can literally inhibit reasoning and critical thinking. It heightens their state of alertness. Then that's when you see the symptoms of inflexibility, emotional dysregulation, heightened sensory sensitivities. And then how does that impact? Well, if they're in fight, flight, or freeze, it's going to impact their learning. It's going to impact social and emotional functions. It's going to impact their willingness to, go out and be independent and do new things. It can impact their ability to handle change. So again, some of the things that we look at is we first have to look at, does your child have any primitive reflexes that's inhibiting development? All right, inhibiting development in their motor systems, gross motor, fine motor, inhibiting development in their visual system and their auditory system, because all of those systems are really key and critical for multisensory processing, right? And it's really critical for the brain to develop. Here's a question. Has anyone explained to you the role of primitive reflexes and how it can impact the development of the brain and specifically sensory processing? And then also, do you feel like your child is functioning more out of a sympathetic nervous system base, which is more of like that emotional dysregulation, sensory sensitivities like tactile, auditory? Or do you feel like it's more related to, it's a yes or no question. So do you feel like it's more related to their functioning out of sympathetic? Yes or no? And has anyone talked about primitive reflexes and how that can impact sensory processing? Let's see what you guys have to say. And thank you so much for participating. This is great. So sure enough, 88% of you guys are saying yes, you feel like they're functioning more out of a sympathetic response. And then 65% of you say, no, I've never heard of the role of primitive reflexes and how it can impact their sympathetic nervous system. So that's one thing that we really look at Brain Balance, because again, we're looking for the root causes of why. Why do you feel like you're seeing the symptoms that you're seeing with your child? So we look at things from a developmental perspective, but then we also have to look at things from a hemispheric perspective. There's two hemispheres of the brain. You have the right hemisphere, you have the left hemisphere, all right? I always like to say, think of your left hemisphere as your gas pedal. It's your processing hemisphere, all right? And think of your right hemisphere as the brake pedal. All right. It's your brake pedal of the hemisphere of the brain. Now, when we look at what each hemisphere is responsible for, the right hemisphere of the brain is about being able to see the big picture. It's about nonverbal communication. It's also about being flexible. It's also your emotional regulator. Okay. So it's your modulation of emotions. Okay. The right hemisphere of the brain is also responsible for sensory perception. Okay, sensory perception. So when we're talking about hyposensitivity or hypersensitivity, the right hemisphere of the brain has a lot to do with the perception of senses. All right. Right brain also has to do with tactile processing. So the ability to physically feel your body. Again, like I said, it's your social brain. So your ability to be able to handle social situations and read facial expressions. And then the left hemisphere of the brain is more about processing. So it's your ability to process facts and details and memory. It's also about verbal communication, pattern recognition, but then also related to sensory processing, it's related to auditory processing, visual processing. So, both hemispheres of the brain, when we talk about do you see symptoms of hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity? And many of you guys said, well, wow, I really see symptoms of both. Well, that is a direct picture of an imbalanced brain. All right. Because really what's going on is when you have over connections in the brain or areas of the brain that are developed well or even above average, and then there's areas of the brain that are underdeveloped, all right, you have this imbalance that takes place. And here's the thing, for optimal processing to have you have to have a balanced brain to have a teachable brain. All right, I always say a connected brain is a teachable brain. A connected brain is the ability to be able to multisensory process. It's that ability to be able to perceive senses, which is that right brain, and it's the ability to process that, which is the left brain. So you need both hemispheres of the brain cross communicating effectively and efficiently. They need to be constantly communicating, and you need strong highway systems or strong neural pathways where they're connected. They need to be in sync. It's almost as if you think about a symphony, right? And there's different instruments in different areas of the orchestra. They need to be communicating, they need to be in sync. I don't know if you've ever listened to like an elementary orchestra or an elementary band, right? In elementary school, where they're learning their instruments and they're probably a little out of sync, right? Versus a professional symphony where they're in sync and it's beautiful because they're going back and forth. So, all to say that for optimal processing, you really have to have both hemispheres developing. They need to be cross communicating. And that is what is going to help related to sensory processing, because you need that sensory perception to be appropriate and you need that sensory processing to be appropriate. And when it's not, it's literally you have some areas of the brain that are maturing faster, and then it can even become overworked. And that's when you can also see that hypersensitivity taking place. So many times I'll have a parent, they'll say to me, Amanda, why is it that when I ask them to go like put their clothes away, their shoes away, they can't hear me? But yet I might be talking to my husband and we're talking about the birthday that's coming up, and we're talking low and quiet because we're really trying to keep some secrets. And it's just amazing how he can hear that, right? And so those are the things where, again, sometimes you can see where your child may be gifted, right, in certain sensory areas. But the reality is that you really have to have more of a balanced brain. All right, a balanced brain. So one of the things that we want to provide for you tonight is we really want to provide this resource guide. This is great for you as a parent because we actually give you some do it yourself sensory travel kits when you're going out of town or, summer's coming. Some things that can really help activate the brain and help with reduction of that oversensory hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. But the other thing that's really helpful about this guide is we explain a lot around sensory processing. So this is great for educators, even like church leaders that maybe have your child in children's church or something. Of course, it's great for therapists. It gives a good understanding and explanation for the sensory system and learning and related to the brain. And then it also can explain about hyper and hyposensitivity. And then it actually provides you some great resources. So this is in the chat, but also it will be emailed out for anyone that signed up for this webinar. So this is something that's super helpful, that for sure we want to have as a resource for you. So then the question is, okay, Amanda, if I have a better understanding of what's going on in my child's brain, then what do we do? Well, the good news is that we can strengthen brain connectivity. It's the study of neuroplasticity that says that you can actually develop neural pathways in the brain throughout a person's entire life. So this is why we have an adult program, we have a child's program, because we can actually strengthen brain connectivity. And so the question always is, okay, well, how do you do that? Well, we want to focus in on the areas of weakness. All right. And so the first thing we look at is we definitely have to look at, are there primitive reflexes that's inhibiting development? But also, too, there's underdevelopments in the brain taking place that's causing those primitive reflexes to be active. So we need to strengthen brain connectivity. And how do we do that? Well, we focus on areas of weakness and the weak hemisphere of the brain that's driving an imbalance. And then here's what the research says. To have optimal development and to build brain connectivity, there has to be multiple sensory input simultaneously with increased intensity over a period of time, meaning that we can activate the brain through your child's sensory systems. So, auditory, visual, tactile, even olfactory. So, when we find where the areas of weaknesses are, then we can create a customized plan to actually utilize their senses to activate the brain, but then also improve their motor functions, gross motor, fine motor. We need to activate their visual system, their auditory system. And then there's also certain exercises that we can actually do and activities that we can do in the center that really works on multisensory processing, getting that brain to be able to cross communicate more effectively and efficiently. So again, it's really putting together a customized plan where we want to focus in on where are there areas of weakness in brain function, and then how do we strengthen those areas to get better brain connectivity. So areas where we have to consider is that we really look at, again, putting together a customized plan specifically for your child. We want to look at, do they have any active primitive reflexes that's inhibiting development? We also look at their sensory perception versus their sensory processing. So we really want to see, where is your child functioning based on children their age? We look at their visual system, their auditory system, their ability to smell, their ability to feel, because that's really important to see, where are those hypersensitivities, where are those hyposensitivities, and how is that brain processing? And then we also have to look at their motor skills as well, gross motor, fine motor, and then also look at the way that their brain is cross communicating. And that's that whole multisensory processing element. Then we also consider their visual system and eye tracking. Because I will say that the visual system has a lot to do with focus and attention. It has a lot to do not only with reading, but it also has a lot to do with controlling impulsivity. And again, that frontal lobe that has to do with regulation of sensory input and modulation of sensory input. So there's a lot of things that we have to look at to assess and be able to consider, to then be able to put together a customized plan. If you're an adult or if you're a child, these are the things that we look at. We compare them based on their child's your child's chronological age, and then you would meet with the directors and then put together a plan of action specifically for your family and for your child. Now, if you are a professional and you're with us tonight, please put your name and your email address and what city you're zooming in from in the chat right now. We actually have a special toolkit for educators and for professionals that are working with children and even adults that may struggle. It's so robust with a lot of different techniques and tips and tricks that you can do to activate the brain and to get better processing taking place. So we love to have professionals. So please put your information in the chat right now. And we're about to, I'm about to answer some live questions, but all to say that your next step is to reach out to one of the centers. If you're saying, okay, Amanda, I want to know, and I want to be able to understand specifically about my child, then that's where you would reach out to one of the centers, call, make an appointment with them, and they will sit down with you and be able to go through all of the different things that we look at and be able to discuss plans of actions specifically for your child and for your family. So now I think we have some time. We do have some time for some questions. Again, I hope this was helpful information, things to really think about related to how your child's brain is functioning, and then where there can be areas of growth, because that is the good news, is that we can improve connectivity in the brain. We can improve processing in the brain to help reduce the symptoms that you're seeing and experiencing right now. All right, so what are some questions that we have?
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. One of the questions that we've had tonight is there a particular age that brain balance is most effective or a point at which it's no longer effective?
That's a great question. It's a common question, but it's a great question because I often say when you have a younger child, let's say they're 5 years old, right? Perhaps the imbalance or the underdevelopments in the brain are not as significant because they're young, right? They're chronologically young. Whereas you have a teenager or you have a young adult, the good news is their brain is physically more developed to where we can actually make change quickly. And we can actually build more neural pathways in those areas of the brain. But yet, there may be more of an imbalance, right? Because as the child becomes older, their symptoms may change. It may look very different in a teenager versus a child. But at the same time, their brain is more physically developed. So I love working with teenagers and young adults and even adults, but obviously in young children as well, right? They're younger, so their imbalance may not be as great. So the bottom line is that just as the research says, we can improve the function of the brain from young children all the way into adulthood. And so that's the good news. It's never too late. And of course, taking action as soon as you can is awesome and great, but we can really serve all ages. And there are advantages to the different ages. They're just a little different. So that's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you. Could you go into a little bit more why temper tantrums extend past the toddler age when kids are struggling with sensory processing?
Sure. So typically, and I talk a lot about this. I do a lot of training with coaches and directors that we work with, and we even talk about this with parents that behavior and meltdowns, really, we look at it from a perspective of dysregulation, that their nervous system is dysregulated. Okay. And so that's where their nervous system is more in that fight, flight, or freeze, where their nervous system is saying danger, danger, danger. And so the brain is not able to handle, maybe it's sensory stimuli, right? But their brain is not able to handle it appropriately. And so it creates this overwhelming anxiety, meltdown mode, shutdown mode, um, view. But I always say to parents that you have to view meltdowns as their nervous system being dysregulated. And so the way that we work with children that are having meltdowns is we actually activate the brake pedal of the brain to help get them out of that fight, flight, or freeze and get them into a better place of reasoning and comprehension. One of the most powerful ways, actually, to help get a child out of a meltdown is actually utilizing certain smells or essential oils that activate the brake pedal. Smells such as eucalyptus, lavender, like a real woody lavender smell, peppermint. Did I say eucalyptus? I might have said eucalyptus. Eucalyptus, peppermint, lavender, um, and get them to smell. Like, don't even try to talk them out of the meltdown. Just try to get them. And of course, we recommend using essential oils, but try to get them to smell, because olfactory and smell is one of the most powerful ways. It's a direct highway to the frontal lobe or the brake pedal of the brain. So you can actually get them to do some smells, some deep breathing, which we call diaphragmatic breathing, where you mirror for them what deep breathing looks like, because a lot of times their heart rate is rapid and they're very in a place of just emotional meltdown mode, right? So they're not able to reason. So that's where talking isn't really optimal at that point. It's actually working with their nervous system to get them out of fight, flight, or freeze. Same thing in adults. There are strategies and techniques very similar to get your nervous system out of that place of fight, flight, or freeze. And those are some things that we train parents on and teach parents as they come through the program, is to really put the lens of more of a neurological dysregulation lens on, when you're dealing with your child having meltdowns, because that's really what's going on, is their little brains in fight, flight, or freeze, which inhibits reasoning, critical thinking, and they respond out of emotions versus reasoning and critical thinking. So I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Amanda. For families that are experiencing tough behaviors at home, how do parents know if it's simply a learned behavior or a choice versus something going on deeper?
Yeah, that's a great one, because even a child that could be arguing with you, right? Um, what I often say to parents is, I say, I want you to, when your child's having behavioral problems, can they reason with you? Like, are they really reasoning, or are they arguing with, really, they're not listening to what you're saying. They're not able to absorb what you're saying. They're not really responding from what you're saying. They're responding, but they're not responding to what you're saying. They're just fighting to fight or argue to argue. Because even in that situation, their brain most likely is in fight mode. And so, I always say, think about, is your child really reasoning with you and responding? Because if they're not, then they're responding out of a dysregulated nervous system. Another thing that I often have parents consider is, think about, do you feel like you're a broken record and you're having to have the same conversations over and over again? Because that also means that your child's brain isn't teachable. They're not learning from these conversations. And that's a really critical sign of an imbalance in the brain taking place or a disconnected brain. When you feel like you're having to have the same conversations over and over again and they're not making behavioral changes based on your parenting skills and based on your feedback, then you really have to consider that there's something more going on underneath, where their brain is disconnected. And so if you feel like there's a disconnect in them not learning, from what their experiences are. So are they learning from their experiences? Are they learning from conversations that you're having? If they're not, then that is definitely a sign and a symptom of a disconnected brain. And if you have a disconnected brain, the brain's not teachable. If you have a connected brain is a teachable brain. That's what's really important. So I hope that was helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. We have a lot of questions about kiddos aged 0 to 3 prior to the brain balance program and what types of activities they could be doing to promote optimal brain health.
Oh my goodness. There's so much you guys can be doing. All right. First of all, get those iPads out of the way. All right. Because screens are not great for children. And even the research shows they're not great for children under the age of 3. So please, please get the smartphones, get the iPads out of the way. What you can do is you have to think motor, motor, motor is your mantra because motor develops the brain, gross motor, fine motor. The more your child plays and has experiences utilizing their big motor systems and their small motor systems, the more the brain is developing. And then also sensory input. All right. So auditory input, music, visual input, different tactile opportunities. And that's why play is so important. Playing in the dirt, playing in the sand, playing in different types of, in the water, right? Having that sensory input is super, super helpful as well. Because remember, senses develop the brain and motor develops the brain, gross motor, fine motor. So, again, the better coordination your child has, I say a coordinated body is a coordinated brain. If you see your child having difficulties in coordination, that's actually an early sign and symptom of underdevelopments taking place in the brain. So those are things that are super important. If you have children that are under the age of 3, they should be playing, playing, playing. They don't need to learn their letters at 3 years old. They don't need to learn colors and shapes. Well, maybe colors and shapes starting at 3, but at 2 and 1 years old, they need to be playing, having experiences, because experiences create neural pathways, and those experiences need to be rich. They need to be rich with sensory input, auditory, visual, tactile, smell, and they also need to be rich with motor input, gross motor, fine motor. So provide them a lot of experiences, create a lot of fun activities, because at that age they're learning so much, but their brain is developing tremendously. So those are great ages for those things. What else?
Thanks, Amanda. If a family is ready to take the next step and not only get answers for their family, but create that plan and get started with that plan, what does a typical program look like for a student?
Sure. So they'll come in, you guys will make an appointment, you will meet with the director. Of course, we're going to look at some things and with your child. Again, the things that we talked about that we consider, we look for primitive reflexes, we look at their sensory systems, their visual system, their auditory system. We really look for the baseline of comparing your child to a child that is their chronological age. Once we gather that information, we actually will put together a customized plan. With that customized plan, you're a part of that conversation. We're going to definitely get feedback from you as well. But basically, we have sessions in center. We also have an at home program as well. And we have the adult program. So there's lots of different options that are available. If you come in the center, they're 1 hour sessions. The sensory motor room looks like a gym for the brain. It's a lot of fun. It's very interactive. Your child will hit different stations. They'll have different goals and different activities. They get a full body workout, but we're also working their sensory systems. We're working that visual system, the auditory system. We're working the area of the brain for multisensory processing. And then they go into the cognitive room. And in the cognitive room, of course, we're going to look at cognitive exercises that will help develop the brain as well. And so it's very much customized based on your child's needs, based on what we find in looking at their baseline. And then also, too, we create a customized plan based on your family. So we also include a nutrition program where you meet with a nutritionist. There's some at home components as well. So it's very much customized specifically for your family and for your child. And we walk you through the whole process. And again, the goal is to develop a brain that's teachable, develop a brain that is cross communicating effectively and efficiently, and again, having better connectivity. So if you have better connectivity in the brain, you should see a reduction in the symptoms that you're experiencing. Great.
Awesome. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So, can a brain imbalance in these symptoms improve on its own as a child gets older, or is it something that does need to be addressed?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where, just like I was saying, when you have symptoms taking place, typically when they're younger, there are certain symptoms that you may see. Like they may be a space invader, right? They may be a little awkward or clumsy, or maybe, they fall down and they are bleeding and they're not crying, right? Um, so there are physical symptoms that you could be seeing. But typically, as the child becomes older, the symptoms can change. The actual root of social and emotional development is actually the foundation of that is the ability to physically feel your body. So if you're not physically feeling your body, then you're not able to connect to what you're feeling emotionally. So you're physically not feeling your body. But then, of course, when people ask you, well, how does that make you feel? You're going to be a bit disconnected and not be able to process your own feelings. And then guess what? That impacts the development of empathy when you having to consider other people's feelings. Because if you're not really able to process feelings appropriately, that's going to impact your ability to empathize. So what we find is that as they're young, there's certain signs and symptoms. And then as they get older, the symptoms can change and look different, but there's still concerns there. And then when you think about young adulthood and we're needing that executive functioning and we're needing those independent skills, to be able to get up on time and get to work or to get to college and to get to class and to organize their day and to be a good employee and keep a job. Again, when you have underdevelopments in the brain, there's going to be struggles all along their life. And so they may look different, but typically what the research shows, and actually Dr. Barkley, he does a lot of research on the longitudinal studies of brain development, is that what they found is as the child becomes older, the imbalance becomes greater and their brain age becomes younger as they chronologically become older. So instead of being a 15-year-old, they could be functioning like a 12-year-old or an 11-year-old. When they're 18, they could be functioning like a 14-year-old. That actually it becomes more of a disparity as they become older. So it is important, to do everything you can to optimize brain function. Part of our program in the at home program portion is we actually educate you on how to create an environment at home that fosters optimal brain development. Because that is important, what you do at home and things that they're exposed to can also impact brain development. So yes, there are things you can do at home, but of course, getting to the root of why you're seeing these symptoms will be super helpful and getting a plan of action in place for that. So, great question. All right. Well, We want to honor your time tonight. Thank you so much for participating. We'll have one more poll question at the end. Please answer that question, but reach out to your local Brain Balance. They are there to help you specifically and take the next step by booking an appointment and really get specific information about your child and what the plan of action could be created and made for you and your family. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I really hope that this was helpful information, and we will see you again maybe next month. We do these monthly. We have these different hot topics that we talk and discuss about. And if this was helpful for you and you have a friend that you feel like it will be helpful for, send them the recording. You'll get the recording after this, and feel free to send it out to your friends. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.